Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yurachek.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Scott Burwell, and he is the CEO and founder of Neurotype, which is a wearable brain sensing tool for recovery for people with substance use disorders. So essentially, this is a wearable neurotech that cures your opioid addiction and withdrawals. So Scott, pleasure to have you on the show. Do you want to, you laughed a little bit when I said that. Do you want to maybe correct what I just said, the mistake I just made?
No, you're in the right realm. It sounded good. Yeah, but we're building neuroassessment and neurofeedback tools for people going through addiction recovery to support their recovery track. And it uses portable brain sensing headsets. And so we're using other companies' portable brain sensing headsets that use EEG. And the idea is that this sort of data that we collect from the devices and the new areas of treatment that are possible from these devices can increase patient engagement and potentially improve the patient outcomes. And right now we're focused on opioid use disorders, but it's our long-term goal to next step to other substances like nicotine and other kinds of addictions and afflictions like depression and these sorts of things.
Okay, sounds good. So when you're on opioids, life is pretty good and you feel great. So why do you feel the need to improve that?
But yeah, the thing about opioids is when a person is using opioids, and this kind of applies to other substances, other drugs of abuse, but the reinforcing effects of, for instance, opioids tend to reinforce your attraction to all the other things that you see in the situation that you're using opioids. For instance, the stimuli or the paraphernalia that you're interacting with, the people that you're interacting with, the places that you're interacting with. And opioid withdrawal is a really severe thing. Opioid overdose is a really dangerous thing, especially with the introduction of like fentanyl. And so when you encounter these sorts of cues, these triggers in your environment, things like the paraphernalia, the people, the places that you used to use. If you're trying to quit using opioids, these things can trigger you to crave and trigger you to eventually relapse. And that sort of thing is just really not well assessed using current addiction medicine assessment tools, which are largely just self-report based questionnaire dialogue, that kind of thing. And so we're building, using these brain sensing headsets, a way to measure how your brain responds to those triggers and provide a way to target therapies. So neurofeedback therapies or potentially neuromodulation therapies using brain stimulation techniques to train your brain to respond less to those dangerous cues in the environment that are potentially bad for your addiction.
Yeah, definitely like a pattern interrupt. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit how you got into this. Before we started recording, you said you were in academia and then you shared an interesting story. And this is why the podcast is such a good format, is that your parents owned a liquor store. I had made the joke that when you and your friends raided the liquor cabinet, that had a different meaning. Do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, well, we never raided the liquor cabinet. And, I didn't even really party all that much growing up. And I got a face to see working behind the counter of a liquor store. You see some cases where people clearly have struggled with addiction. And one interesting side of addiction to that, from that perspective. And then also my parents owned this small business for 32 years. And into my dad's mid-late 60s, he was working up to 70 hours a week at this place. And you'd think that sort of exposure would scare me away from entrepreneurship and wanting to start a business of my own. But here I am. And I started there. I worked at our family's liquor store a lot growing up. And then I went to the University of Minnesota. I went to the Minnesota Center for Twin and Family Research there, where we studied behavior genetics and how genetics and your environment influence your brain. And there I worked on some EEG projects with some really big data sets and worked with another mentor at the Schwartz Center for Computational Neuroscience, where they founded the EEG Lab software. And so I've got a lot of EEG experience, but it really wasn't until fast forward to a few years ago where I went to a workshop at Yale University focused on these sort of translations of very focused academic findings into potentially therapeutics or other sort of real world impact tools that you could commercialize outside of academia, the Innovation to Impact program at Yale. And from that, I pitched this idea where we're using these portable brain sensing headsets to measure cue reactivity and drug cue reactivity in people. And some people from the National Institute on Drug Abuse were very interested, and that sort of encouraged me to just make this final jump and start a company. So the company is called Neurotype Inc. We've been around for a little over 2 years, and we have some software developers. We have some University of Minnesota research connections and other collaborators that are with us on this at this moment.
Yeah, very cool. So do you want to describe the technology a little bit, how it works, why it works, all this kind of stuff?
Yeah, at its core. So I'll talk just a sec again about what addiction clinics look like currently. Right now, a clinical interaction in addiction clinic is almost entirely based on self-report dialogue data, questionnaires between a therapist or a clinician and a patient. And this can be a burden for clinicians. It takes a lot of time. It takes effort. It can involve a lot of subjectivity. What you believe is a severe symptom, another person might not believe, or what a patient perceives as a symptom might not be as severe as it is in another person. And so this sort of subjectivity and this bias can introduce a lot of fuzziness into clinical interactions. And what we're trying to do is use these brain sensing devices to measure some objective biomarkers that can help make objective decisions and objective treatment benchmarks accessible in addiction clinics. What we do is, at its core, a patient sits in front of a laptop wearing one of these portable EEG headsets. We're using dry electrode EEG that uses these comb electrodes. So the setup time for this is much quicker than it takes 30 seconds to a minute versus a traditional laboratory EEG, which takes 20 minutes to an hour sometimes if you got 128 channels to set up. And a person sits down with a tablet in front of them wearing one of these headset devices. We record their brain potentials when they're viewing pictures. Some of those pictures are of pleasant things like chocolate cake and puppy dogs. Some of those things are boring things like office supplies. And then occasionally there's mixed in a syringe or another opioid related cue like a pill bottle. And for a person with a opioid use disorder, their brain responds to those opioid cues in a similar pattern that their brain responds to the chocolate cake and puppy dogs. And that biomarker signature that we're talking about is associated with, has been linked to things like relapse, treatment dropout in other studies that have been done on larger samples in laboratory settings. And so this is really a risk biomarker and a way to stratify patients based on their risk. But it's also potentially a way to provide therapy and engagement practices.
So what the environment that you intend to have this be used is a clinic, recovery clinic. It wouldn't be necessarily something that you take home. This would be like with a trained expert, something like that.
Yeah, the way that we're structuring it now is to be a point of care device. If it's telemedicine, it could be something that you have at your house. But for the moment, we're focused on using this in outpatient clinic settings where a therapist is making the final call, because addiction is incredibly complex. And I'm not naive enough to believe that this is the only thing that's going on. There's a lot of other, psychosocial and socioeconomic considerations to take into account. Now, this is one dimension. This is one dipstick that you can check, but there's a lot of other things that are going on that we want the clinician to be able to have sort of the final say. At this point, with more data and with time, I think we're moving towards an at-home sort of focus. But
yeah, it's really interesting. It's almost like you said, like a dipstick, a measurement to see how much they love the addiction and how hard it's going to be to break that love and break that addiction. This is like a psychological, that's like the psychological side of things, but can you also see the physiological side of things, or this is more like a psychological measurement?
Yeah, it is unique in that it is a physiological measurement. So the measurement that we're taking is called an event-related potential. And for those that are not familiar with it, it is a fluctuation in brain potential. So the electricity that's generated by your brain in response to an event. And in this case, the event is a picture being shown on a screen. And to date, there are really no physiological or biomedical measurements being taken in addiction settings unless they are things like urine drug screens, or occasionally people get their blood pressure checked, or other sorts of really more generic or health related, not disorder specific kinds of measurements. And this is what this really taps into is somebody's attraction or their motivated attention towards opioid related cues that they've developed over repeated use and repeated getting high, for instance, with a substance.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, it is physiological, even if it is measuring like a psychological thing. And yeah, I guess you can have this currently ridiculous sentence of, oh, you've gotten 6% better, you've gotten 16% better. You can actually do that with that quantification versus psychological evaluations right now. It's impossible. So you said you've been around for 2 years. What are some good results, the best results that you've gotten so far?
Yeah, absolutely. We're basing a lot of our biomarker on published neuroscience research that's been around for 20 years. So the technology, the biomarker itself is somewhat old. There's been really cool recent work done from the labs of research by the name of Francesco Versace at MD Anderson Cancer Center. He was a consultant on our grant, as well as Mohammed Parvaz at he's at Mount Sinai in New York. And they've done a lot of the really cool, interesting research that shows that, number one, this relapse vulnerability that comes with the biomarker is heightened in not just smoking, not just cocaine, but it seems to be across many substances. And then also the time course of how somebody's Q reactivity changes over time. What were our major successes in recent years is currently funded by a small business innovation research grant from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And we're setting up for another study. And what we're doing is validating this biomarker and validating the use of portable EEG tools. Everything that to date that has been done is focused using these laboratory assessments that are just not feasible in a clinical setting. It would take way too much time for anyone to set it up, and it would take way too much training for the gains that they're expected to get. And so what we're focused on now is validating this easy headset format that can record this kind of data, as well as showing that there are indeed these correlations in patients over time and over across disorder versus non-disorder. I will also add too, is one thing that's incredibly obvious when you see these data that I think patients aren't always aware of their own level of craving and their own level of vulnerability for relapse. And I think a clinician can definitely attest to this, especially when patients are early starting in treatment. They often believe, yeah, my craving level is 0. I never want to use. And even if I was in a situation where I used to use, I wouldn't be using. But when you see their brain reactivity next to their craving levels, what is that their brain reactivity is telling a totally different picture. And that picture is not being assessed in current addiction settings.
Yeah, I guess current addiction settings, you couldn't tell if a patient is lying to you or lying to themselves as well when the body actually wants something.
Yeah, exactly.
Could this be used for other things like ice cream?
Yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't adapt it for other things. So there have been people that have thought that this is a useful way for neuromarketing. For instance, if I show you pictures of these emotional pictures and then I intersperse like Pepsi and Coca-Cola, for instance, just to use those as an example, right? Hypothetically, the one you like more might elicit a larger brain response than the one you like less. So this brain potential that we're focused on is really a generic sort of response to things that you're attracted to or things that you view as more important than background things.
Yeah, that's really cool. And then could you pair it with like an electroshock therapy to maybe disassociate that love or something like this? So every time you would see maybe the ice cream or something like this, you'd be like, get a shock or like some kind of negative thing. And then you'd be like, I don't like ice cream anymore.
Yeah, honestly, that is very well within the reach of what you can do with this. I wouldn't necessarily say that's our first place to go, but it's a conditioning based brain response. And so you've been conditioned to respond this way to opioid cues, for instance. And if you conduct something like extinction therapy, where you give somebody an opioid placebo many times after they've been so used to taking opioids and they don't experience this rewarding response, you're likely to see the same sorts of extinction that goes on over time. Exposure therapy is another thing that people use. Basically, a therapist walks you through scenarios that are risky for you. They set down a syringe in front of you. If you used to inject heroin and ask, like, where's your craving level now? Where's your anxiety level now? And they try to coach you down. And so we see our tool as being complementary to those things. So you can see from the brain activity, from the brain responses, like what is evocative to a person and how you could have a therapist or brain stimulation to scramble those signals, tamp down that large brain response to evocative things. So ice cream is, I hope, and I think it's one of those things that we could do. And obesity is one of those things that I think we're going to aim for later, because there's a lot of overlap between eating disorders and addiction disorders, for sure.
Yeah, this could definitely be useful, like you said, for a lot of things. You've been doing this for a few years now. What do the next few years look like? What do you hope to achieve? And then maybe 200 years in the future with your company?
I hope to be around in 200 years, but I don't know if I will. But in the next 2 years, we're still focused on some validation step. We're setting up for, given that we have this initial grant, which is called a phase 1 grant from National Institute on Drug Abuse. We're setting up for a phase 2 project with the National Institute on Drug Abuse, where we are going to conduct a larger scale clinical trial. And this is going to be guided by feedback that we've gotten from the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. The one thing that we've learned in talking to clinicians is that the tools that are available, the neurofeedback tools that are common and on the market right now, are rarely, if any, and I don't think any of them are FDA cleared for use. And so anyone, that chooses to use one is taking an awful lot into their own hands. They're putting a little bit of risk on themselves to use a non-FDA cleared device. In order for this sort of thing to be widespread use and for it to be covered by things like insurance, FDA clearance is a really important hurdle to handle. And so we are focused immediately on figuring and validating from the FDA's guidance what is important, how we're going to ensure that this sort of thing is safe and effective. And so we have a couple projects lined up right now where we're proposing for grant money to do this sort of thing. And then in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to do some more fundraising once we get those grants in hand to support our pathway and do more of this interactions with clinicians and patients to see what they find valuable, what they find to be useful in the technology.
Yeah, I definitely like this path of what they call non-dilutive funding, finding grants and everything like this. I tried to look for you on Crunchbase, and it looks like you guys hadn't raised any investor money, but I think that's good because you're essentially giving part of your control to another entity, which I've seen end up very horribly. It can be very a negative thing. I guess with this in mind a little bit, what have been some of your challenges, the biggest challenges in your company so far?
Yeah, and I'll just back up. One of the benefits of being non-dilutive and having us in control of the whole company and the vision of the company is that we're not easily skewed by the flashy thing at the moment or the thing that looks cool on at face value, but the technology below it hasn't been scientifically validated. We'd like to build something that is commercially attractive, but we also want to make sure that it's scientifically valid. And so I guess the major challenges with the company right now is that this sort of no brain assessments using objective brain sensors are really being conducted in addiction therapy today. There are a few occasional neurofeedback clinics and smaller shops that set up, but the major clinics and the major approach to addiction therapy and addiction assessments is largely based on a conversation that happens between a patient and a clinician. So introducing this sort of thing is entirely novel, especially trying to introduce it in clinics now that where people might not be totally familiar with the background science, and showing them the science that suggests that there is some clinical utility and clinical validation that's been done and that this has promise for their setting. That's a major thing. Another thing, we are developing technology that is traditionally measured in a laboratory setting. And while there have been major strides in the development of EEG headsets, even in just the last 10 years, the technology hurdles that you run into, such as like dealing with noise from your environment, just the electrical current coming out of your computer's charging cable, like that is a headache in and of itself. And developing workarounds, developing technology that can be robust to that, which I believe like this event-related potential approach is a challenge in itself. And so it's fun to deal with these sorts of problems, but it can be a major headache, and you sometimes run into things that you just did not expect. And so I would say this probably the same sort of stuff that any sort of disruptive technology encounters. For sure.
Yeah, for sure. I'm in this space as well. And yeah, like this, it's so sensitive to electrical stuff. And even something, you have a DC power supply, you don't have AC, but even that DC power supply introduces noise. So it's pretty rough.
Yeah. And the technology, like I say, has gotten a lot better over the past 10 years, but still, it's not anything like having a shielded room with one power supply and everything is behind some sort of shielding.
Really. Well, Scott, this has been excellent. I think this has been a good introduction to your company. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
I think we covered all the bases. I just want to thank you for having me on. And if anyone is interested in learning more about us or wants to get involved, I'd love to have people reach out. My email is scott@neurotype.io. So feel free to reach out to me there.
Excellent. Yeah. And this will be in the show notes as well, so people can look it up. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on.
Great. Absolutely. Thank you, Layden.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.